Yeah, we're gonna be watching the newest video of Nile Red making bulletproof wood.
This video has been sponsored by Brilliant. A few years ago, I was able to successfully make some transparent wood, and I thought it was pretty cool. While I was working on that project, though, I accidentally stumbled onto something else wood related that I thought was
Wood.
really interesting. More specifically, I stumbled onto this paper published in Nature, and it was called Processing Bulk Natural Wood into a High Performance Structural Material. From this title alone, it didn't sound too spectacular, but the results were actually really impressive, and they were apparently able to make pieces of wood which were by weight stronger than steel. What I thought was even more interesting,
Stronger than
though, was
steel,
something
but
that they
still not
said
fireproof.
near the end of the paper. It was just a quick comment, but they suggested that with their super strong wood, it might be possible to make lightweight and low cost armor, or in other words, bulletproof wood. Up until this point,
Bulletproof
the
wood.
idea of using wood to block bullets had honestly never even occurred to me, but the moment that I saw this, I felt that I had to try making some. The only tricky part was that, again, the idea of wooden armor was only a suggestion they made based on some small scale tests, and they never actually tried to stop a bullet with it. However, if their wood were actually as strong as they claimed, I felt that it should have been possible,
Probably the
and I figured there
flexibility.
was only one way to find out. But anyway, to get started,
Be
the
able to
first
make
step
armor has to
was
be
to
somewhat
figure out how to
flexible.
even make it. So I looked at the experimental section in the paper, and it actually seemed surprisingly simple. All
Basswood,
I had to do was two
basswood,
basic
bass,
steps, where the
base.
first one was to treat almost any kind of wood using some commonly available chemicals, and then after that, I just had to squish it and heat it. This was supposed to leave me with a really dense and strong piece of wood that was roughly a fifth of the thickness of the original piece. The only problem was that even though it seemed really simple, I didn't really know exactly how to do it. I mean, for the first part, I
You
was
need an
totally
industrial
fine,
press.
and I had everything that was needed to treat some wood with some chemicals. The second part was the issue, though, because I had no idea how I was supposed to evenly crush a piece of
On
wood
a carbon
while
fiber.
heating it at the same time. To do this, I figured that I was gonna need some sort of press thing, and my first thought was to get something like a panini press and to stack a bunch of weight onto it.
Bad
However, I
idea.
then converted the 5 megapascals that the paper said I needed into a unit that I could actually understand, and it was apparently 725 pounds per square inch. This meant that even for a small piece of wood, I'd have to stack thousands of pounds onto it, which I felt would
That'll
be
break.
slightly difficult. It was pretty clear that I was going to have
Yeah,
to
the
use some
panini
sort of
press would
machine
break.
that was actually designed to heat and crush at high pressures, and I decided to try looking online. The first thing that I found were those press things that are used to squish designs onto t shirts, but unsurprisingly, they didn't get even remotely close to enough pressure. With a bit more searching, though, I stumbled onto what seemed like the perfect solution, and it was something called the Nug Smasher Pro. It was clearly meant to crush a different plant material and not wood, but either way, it basically had everything that I needed. It had two nice big plates to
Like
squish things
smashing.
evenly. It could crush things with up to 40,000 pounds of force, which was way more than I needed, and it had a built in temperature controller that I could easily set to the required 100 degrees Celsius. I really felt that it looked perfect, and I wanted to just buy it, until I noticed that the plates were made of aluminum, which would get destroyed by the chemicals I'd be using, and it also cost $3,600 US, which was almost $5,000 Canadian. This pretty much killed almost any
Ah,
excitement that I had, but it wasn't a complete loss because I now knew exactly what I needed. So, with this in mind,
money.
I then ventured over to Alibaba, and within a few minutes, I found what actually looked like the perfect machine. It had some nice stainless steel plates, which could easily resist the chemicals. It could crush with even more pressure, and it could do around 60,000 pounds of force. And it had some easy to use temperature controllers. The only problem was that it was still really expensive, and the final quote that I got was actually more than the Nug Smasher Pro. At the
Oh
time, this was also
yeah, the material it
significantly more
costs.
than I'd ever spent on any project, and the thought of paying that much on
Hey,
an idea
2020.
that might not even work made me really uncomfortable. I decided to ignore all logic and reasoning, though, and $5,000 and a few months later, I was the proud owner of an extremely heavy wooden box. I was actually kind of surprised by just how heavy it was, and I was slightly worried that I wasn't going to be able to move it from where the delivery guys had dumped it. With the help of Reggie, though, we were able to drag it partially across the room, and I figured that this was a good place to crack it open. So I went and got a knife, and I started by cutting off all the plastic strapping. I then started flipping up all the metal tabs that were holding down the top of the crate, and after that, I slowly opened it and revealed my beautiful little press. I then carefully broke apart the rest of the crate, and I got rid of all the plastic and the
getting that,
accessories. Reggie and I
if you
also
get that
snapped our
delivered, like,
backs,
what the hell
transferring
are
this
they
400
getting?
pound hunk of metal to a dolly, and at this point, I was starting to get really excited. After months of waiting, the press was actually here in front of me, and it was finally time to try and make some bulletproof wood. To get started with this, the first thing that I needed was some wood, and according to the paper, it was possible to use many different kinds, like cedar, oak, poplar, and pine. I decided to go with pine though, because it seemed to give some really good results, and it was also by far the cheapest and easiest to get. All I had to do
Yeah,
was
money
quickly go
problem.
to Home Depot, and for around $20, I picked up one of the nicest pieces that I could find. I then did some quick measurements and I started chopping it up, and my goal was to get some pieces that were roughly 12 centimeters long, 3.5 centimeters deep, and 4.4 centimeters wide. This was very close to what the paper said was the typical sample size that they used, and I figured that at least for my first attempt, I should probably do exactly what they did. But either way, with all of the pieces chopped off, I then quickly sanded them to clean them up a bit, and now my wood was ready to be cooked. So I went and got a 1 liter beaker, and I started by pouring in about 600 mils of water. I then turned on the
Regular
stirring, and when I
water.
had a strong vortex going, I dumped in 80 grams of sodium hydroxide drain cleaner. This all quickly started dissolving and
Drain
generating
cleaner.
a lot of heat, and over the next several minutes, it all slowly disappeared. When it looked more or less clear, I then got this sodium sulfite that I bought on Amazon,
For
which was
curing
apparently
salmon eggs.
supposed to be used to cure salmon eggs.
Weird.
I wasn't exactly sure what that meant, but either way, I just dumped in 40.3 grams of it, and just like the drain cleaner, I waited for it to dissolve. This ended up going quicker than I thought, and only a few minutes later, I had a relatively clear solution, and I was able to get rid of the stir bar. At this point, my chemical solution was ready, and now it was time to add the wood. So I carefully lowered in one of the pieces, and while holding it in place, I added more water until it got to the 1 liter mark. After that, I put a heavy watch glass on top of it to push it back down into the water, and what I had to do next was get it nice and hot. So I turned on the
Get it
hot
hot and
plate
wait.
and waited for it to heat up, and over the next 20 minutes, it slowly got more and more yellow. Eventually, it was just on the verge of boiling, and it was around 100 C, and at this point, I just had to leave it like this. I then came back to it a couple hours later, and it had become a dark orange, and things seemed to be going
Wood
well.
water.
During this time, I had also swapped the watch glass for a flask filled with cold water, and I had added a small wood spacer. This allowed me to completely submerge the piece of wood, which I felt was a lot
Finally did
better,
it.
even though it was probably fine how it was before. But anyway, at least based
It
on the
probably.
color, there was clearly a reaction going on here, and in theory, the chemicals were supposed to be attacking the wood. More specifically, they were supposed to be attacking and removing two major
This looks like
components of the wood called lignin
whiskey
and hemicellulose,
or rum.
which are the main things that keep the wood
That's where they
together.
get their
It
colors
was
from.
very important to not get rid of them completely, though,
On
because
the
then
wooden
all
barrels
the wood would just
they
fall
are in,
apart, and
or
I
they'll
would
be
just be
clear.
left with a bunch of loose cellulose. So instead, the goal was to only partially remove them, which would make a lot of extra space in the wood, and the research paper had some good photos of what was supposed to happen. For example, they included a super close-up shot that's looking down the end grain of a generic untreated piece of wood. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on, but all of the gray stuff is technically the wood itself, and all of the black
Like
areas are
plastic.
just empty space, which is normally used by the tree to transport things like water. This, on the other hand, was what it looked like after they treated it, and there was a pretty big difference. With a lot of the lignin and hemicellulose gone, a lot of that gray stuff was gone as well, and it now kind of just looked like a bunch of tubes. These tubes were all mostly made of cellulose, though, and the important part was that there was a lot more space between them and way less stuff holding them in place. This was supposed to make the wood a lot easier to squish, and this was very important for the next step. But anyway, according to the paper, I just had to leave it like this for a total of 7 hours, and this was supposed to get rid of the ideal amount of lignin and hemicellulose. So I just let it sit here for another few hours, and when I came back to it, the solution was way darker than before. This told me
I
that a lot
just
more
need some
stuff had been
alcohol.
removed, and what I had to do
There.
now was wash the wood.
Have
So
whiskey
I
or
just
rum.
quickly got rid of this hot red chemical solution, and then into the same beaker, I started dumping in a bunch of boiling distilled
You
water.
can see
The
the
goal here was to get rid
layers
of
of the
as
wood
much of the sodium
separating
hydroxide
or something.
and sodium sulfite as possible, and to also wash away any side products that might have formed. A lot of these chemicals and side products were deep inside the wood, though, so I had to soak it for a while. The only unfortunate part was that the paper didn't say for how long, and all it said was that I had to immerse it in boiling water several times. I assumed that this meant more than just quickly dunking it in and out, and based on almost nothing, I decided that about an hour was a good time. So I just left it there, and over the next hour, the color of the water slowly changed, and I felt this was a good sign because it meant that it was pulling stuff from the wood. After seeing this, I assumed that after each washing, the water would get less and less colored, but that didn't turn out to be the case. It quickly became pretty clear to me that whatever was causing the color was not a good indicator to tell me when I was done washing it, and instead, I had to keep checking the
That was the
pH.
wood
If there were
itself.
even a small amount of sodium hydroxide left, it would turn purple, which meant that it was strongly basic, and it was still doing this even after the third washing. It was only after washing it 7 times that the color was finally green, which told me that it was around neutral. It also told me that the wood should have been nice and clean, and I dumped off all the water, which was still orange. But either way, after about
A
15
lot of that
hours of
color is from the
cooking
wood.
and cleaning wood, I was finally done the first part of the
Thinning wood.
process. What I was left with should have been a lignin reduced piece of wood that was
Some of
free of
you will
nasty
know what I'm
chemicals,
talking about.
and I was really
Others
curious to see what it was like.
completely
Without a lot of
oblivious.
the lignin and hemicellulose, I was kind of expecting it to be really
Better
soft
if
and
you're
squishy,
oblivious.
but that wasn't at all the case. Even when I squeezed it as hard as I could, I was barely able to do anything, and it was definitely still pretty hard. I also tried bending it, which I wasn't able to do at all, and I started wondering if I'd even done anything to the wood. It really just felt like a generic piece of wood that had been sitting in hot water, and it didn't feel like there was any major difference besides maybe looking different. With all that being said, though, even if it didn't
I like
look
the
or
layers
feel
for
special,
separating.
I had done exactly what the paper had said, and it should have been good. So now, it was finally time to test out my new and beautiful hydraulic press, and the first step was to turn on the temperature controllers. I then waited for the plates to slowly heat up to 100 degrees Celsius, and when they eventually got there, I carefully loaded in my little piece of wood. I did my best to make it as centered as possible, and when I felt that it looked good, I started lowering down the upper plate. It was a bit slow and clunky, but I was eventually able to sandwich the wood, and now it was time to start crushing it. So, I just went ahead and started pressurizing it by manually cranking the handle that was on the side, and it worked exactly like a hydraulic car jack. The only difference was that it was way slower, and each time I cranked it, it looked like it barely moved the plate. It was slowly crushing it though, even if it didn't look like there was a huge
And
difference,
squeezing
and
out
at
the
this
water.
point, it was probably already about 5% thinner. However, it was also oozing out a bunch of black liquid, which I didn't really want to leak all over my press, so I quickly cleaned it up with some paper towel. I then started crushing it again, and so far, I was really happy with how it was going. Unlike with my
That's
hands,
so
the
far.
press was doing a way better job at squishing it, and it did seem like it was a lot easier than squishing a normal piece of wood. This also made
And a
sense
manual
because,
one
as I
rather
mentioned
than
earlier,
a
with a lot of
slowly
the lignin and hemicellulose removed, there was a
machine.
lot more empty space and a lot less holding the cellulose together. So, with some added pressure, these empty spaces were all supposed to start collapsing, and I think the paper again included some really interesting photos of this. This one is, of course, what I showed
Oh,
before, and this was hopefully how my wood currently looked on the microscopic scale. This, on the other hand, is what I was trying to do to it, and again, there was a massive difference. All of the empty space was pretty much completely gone, and all of those cellulose tubes had been completely flattened. On top of
that's a
that,
face.
the flattened tubes had also become intertwined with all of the other
I
flat
could see a
tubes,
face.
and this was supposed to greatly increase its strength. But anyway, I then just continued crushing the wood, hoping that it would
Yeah, you
eventually
can
end
see
up
the
like the
design on
second
the
photo,
wood.
and at first, it seemed to be going pretty well. The only issue that I had was that when it got to around half the thickness, it seemed like something bad was happening at the top. It looked like some of the wood was rolling over onto itself, and I was a bit worried that it might be breaking or something. However, I figured that it probably wasn't a huge issue, and that it's probably normal to have some defects when crushing a piece of wood like this. So I just kept on going, and the goal was to get it to around 20% of the original thickness, and I eventually got there a few minutes later. At this point, it was almost shockingly thin, and even though I'd squished it myself, I still kind of found it hard to believe that this used to be an entire block of wood. Besides just being super thin, though, the pressure on the wood was also around the 725 psi that the paper had called for, and I was apparently done crushing it. So now, what I had to do next was just leave it like this, and all of the water that was still left in the wood was supposed to slowly get boiled out. At the
Yeah,
same time, though,
dehydrated.
the heat and the pressure were also supposed to cause the wood itself to slowly get stronger. This because, according to the paper, all of those
Like he's
flattened and
ironing wood.
intertwined cellulose tubes should start to form bonds within themselves and with their neighboring flat tubes. All of these bonds were technically only weak hydrogen bonds, but because
That's
all of
what
the
you do
cellulose was
when
so
you're ironing.
closely packed together, it should be able to form
Freezing
a
with
ridiculous amount
heat.
of them. It was supposed to be enough to greatly increase the strength of the wood, and more importantly, to permanently lock it in its crushed form. This would make it very different than normal wood, which would just decompress once the pressure was gone, and I was very curious to see how it would turn out. With that being said, though, I then just had to let it cook like this for the next 24 hours, and when I came back to it, it looked like it had become even thinner. I also noticed that the pressure gauge was at zero pressure, which I felt was a really good sign. This because it meant that even without any added pressure, the wood was staying nice and thin, and I started getting pretty excited. It was now time to reveal my densified and hopefully bulletproof wood, and when I felt that I was ready, I started lifting the upper plate. I was really hoping to see a perfect little flat rectangle, but I was immediately disappointed. I mean, it was definitely flat, which I was happy about, except it was also very wide, which wasn't a good sign. There had clearly been some sort of smushing effect because the wood wasn't really supposed to spread out at all, and this was a bit sad to see. Either way, I then went to take it off the press, and the moment that I touched it, all of my sadness quickly vanished. This because it felt completely different than I expected, and it really didn't even feel like it was wood. Instead, it was surprisingly heavy and extremely hard, almost like some sort of ceramic. At the same time, though, it somehow also kind of felt like plastic, and it was genuinely really cool. At the same time, though, it was definitely far from perfect, and just by looking at it, I could see that the fibers didn't get squished down properly. When I looked at it from the side, I could also see some very obvious diagonal cracks, and I was really hoping they were just superficial. I then compared it to the piece of wood that it came from, and it was kind of surprising to see how different it was. I mean, in theory, it probably should have been a little less different and had roughly the same width, but still, I thought it was really impressive to see
Well, of
just how
course
much
it's
thinner it had
red.
become, and I found it hard to believe that this entire block had been squished to this thin little piece. With that being said, though, the next very important thing that I had to
Hard to keep
do
it the same
was test to
size.
see how strong it was.
Yeah, once you
So it was,
squish
of
it,
course,
of
at this
course it's gonna
exact
spread
moment
sideways.
that it decided to spontaneously fall apart. This was extremely sad to say the least, and it didn't inspire a lot of hope, but that all changed when I tried stabbing it with a screwdriver. I then just kept on stabbing it, and I was honestly really impressed by just how little damage it was doing. Better than I thought it would be. Really
I use a
doesn't do
knife.
much of anything. It's pretty hard.
Knife,
To
knife,
really test
knife,
it, though,
knife,
I
knife,
felt that I
knife,
had to try
knife.
stabbing it as hard as I could, and it was still really impressive. What wasn't impressive was my aim, but either way, not only was the screwdriver completely unable to stab into it, it also seemed like it had a hard time even scratching it. This was obviously not a perfect emulation of what would happen if a bullet hit it, but it was looking really promising.
Now you know what you
Just
need
as
to
a
do for
comparison,
tables.
I then did the same thing to one of the untreated pieces of wood, and the difference was pretty obvious. The screwdriver was easily able to stab into it, and I didn't even have to use much force at all. Either way, I was now feeling a lot more hopeful about my little densified piece of wood, and the only thing that I had to do next was see if it could actually stop a bullet. So, I quickly made this little wood thing to mount it to, and I clamped it in a vise. I then quickly added one of my pieces of densified wood, and with it securely in place, I went and got my gun, which was actually just a pellet gun. This is
Okay.
not only because firing a real gun inside my building is both super dangerous and a felony, it was also because it made way more sense to start small. I had
Yeah.
to first make sure that it could actually stop a projectile, and if it did, I could then move up to the more powerful stuff. With that being said, though, the pellet gun was now loaded, and after a few days of work, I was ready for the first real test. So I carefully lined it up and gently
Also, you need
started
to go
pulling on
to
the
a
trigger,
secure place
and I
for a
was
real
really
bullet.
hoping to see the pellet just get deflected like the screwdriver.
I'm gonna go through though.
1, 2, 3. However, that wasn't at all what happened, and it was almost comical how bad it was. The high speed footage that I got was also completely pointless, and I was kind of embarrassed that I had even set it up. I then looked at the footage from the camera that was pointing at the back of it, and it had apparently just exploded. It really didn't look like it had even attempted to stop the pellet, and this was honestly pretty sad to see, especially
That's
after
because
spending
the
thousands of
fibers were
dollars
just being
and
ripped.
waiting for months to
Just
try this. What also made it even sadder was that this pellet gun was over 16 times weaker than one of the weakest real guns. So, it wasn't even remotely close to being able to stop a real bullet, and at this point,
You can see all those
things weren't
fibers.
exactly
The
looking
wooden
good.
fibers are
At
kind
the
of
same
damaged.
time,
They're
though,
not
I was very aware
really
that this was only my
squeezed
first attempt,
together.
and that the piece that I'd made wasn't exactly the highest quality. This was made very clear to me when it had spontaneously fallen in half, and there was obviously a lot of room for improvement. Also, I was still really impressed by how well it had blocked the screwdriver, and in my mind, this proved that it had the hardness to potentially block a projectile. So, I figured that all I had to do was somehow make it stronger
I'm not a
and stop it
scientist.
from exploding,
I'm just saying
and
what's
I had some
happening.
ideas that I
What I
really
think
thought
is
would work.
happening.
The only issue was that right after this, I had to start moving to my new office, and I completely tore apart this entire lab. I then had to build an entirely new one, and it was only 6 months later that I was able to start working on this project again. Either way, I then jumped right back into it, and the first, very sophisticated thing that I'd been waiting to try was to just use a much bigger piece of wood. Seriously, though, this was a very simple change, but I really felt that it would make a huge difference, and I'll explain why in a bit. With that being said, the first thing that I was going to have to do was treat it, and I did pretty much the exact same thing as before, because I didn't think anything really went wrong with this chemical step. The only thing that I did slightly
I think
different this
he should
time
use
was
a
that I used
stronger
a much
wood.
bigger beaker, and I held it down with some glass tubing. This way, it would stay fully submerged the entire time, and after heating it for 7 hours, the solution had turned almost black. I then quickly took everything apart, carefully took out the wood, and washed it to get rid of the chemicals, and again, after 15 hours of work, I was left with a wet block of wood. It looked and felt pretty much exactly the same as the first attempt, and the only difference was that it was bigger, and I loaded it into the hydraulic press. This time, though, I oriented it with the end grain facing the camera, and from this point on, things were going to be pretty different. This because it was pretty clear to me that this pressing step was the major problem, and I actually had a bunch of things that I wanted to try. The first was to do my absolute best to center it perfectly on the plate, and I had made some markings to show me exactly where to put it. I would also use a ruler to confirm the final placement of it, and this was very different than last time, where I had just centered it entirely by eye.
Yep.
With the wood in place, though, I then started lowering
That's
the
better
upper
measuring.
plate, and this was now the moment that I was hoping the bigger piece would
Other
start to
times
be
it's not.
useful. This is because, with its much larger surface area, there would now be a lot more space for the upper plate to sit on, and in theory, this should help keep it level. This was something that never even occurred to me during the first attempt because I thought the upper plate was fixed in place, but I discovered later on that it was apparently able to tilt. I also noticed that this was happening when I closely rewatched the footage, and I saw a very subtle but clear tilt right before things started going wrong. It was only an extremely small shift, and it was probably less than a couple degrees, but crushing the wood on even a slight angle would be really bad because it would force it to get pushed to one side, and this would almost definitely cause it to smear out. This was also especially likely to happen if the piece was significantly off center, like mine was, and if the upper plate was forced to just balance on a small piece of wood. So basically, the tilt was the major thing that I was hoping to avoid here, and I really felt that just using a bigger piece and centering it perfectly was going to have a massive effect. On top of this, though, I also decided to not preheat the plates to 100 degrees Celsius and to try squishing the wood much more slowly. I figured this would give the water a lot more time to get pushed out and avoid any weird internal pressure from building up and potentially damaging the
different
wood.
color
And
this
so
time.
far, things were going pretty well.
But
It
it's the
looked like
same
it was
color, but
basically
the
just getting
way it's
thinner,
coming out.
and that was exactly what I was hoping for. As I kept going, though, it unfortunately started to spread out at the bottom, and it didn't seem like I could do anything to stop it. Going even slower didn't seem to do much either, and when I looked over at the side of it, I saw something horrible. It had also started to roll over onto itself, just like the first time, but it didn't seem nearly as severe, and I figured that it was probably okay. So I just kept on going, and eventually it seemed like the wood had
Yeah,
hit
it's
its
very
limit,
difficult to stop
and
it from
instead of
spreading.
getting denser, it was just squishing out on the sides. At this point, though, the pressure on the gauge was also around the 725 psi mark, and when I saw this, I felt that it was the right time to start cooking it. So I plugged in the press to some sockets that I made by hijacking the power from my dishwasher because I didn't have any real 220 outlets yet. After that, though, I was able to turn on the heating, and now I just had to wait and hope that it wasn't another disaster.
Always had
I then
to
came back to it
wait
24
and
hours
look for
later,
another
and I was really
situation.
curious to know how it turned out. So I carefully started lifting the upper plate, and this time,
At that moment, that was the
I
best thing.
wasn't immediately disappointed.
There it's
Still
bad.
really hot, but looks pretty good. I mean, it definitely still had a bunch of issues, and it had those diagonal cracks like before, but what I thought was really exciting was the other side of it, which was honestly kind of perfect. It didn't look like there were any cracks at all, and the top part was also really nice. It was actually very similar to the original pine that I'd started with, and it didn't have a weird looking texture or any gaps between the fibers. This part just looks really good. It's like perfect. I then compared it to the original piece, and
Oh,
I saw that it
perfect.
didn't spread out nearly as much, and it was definitely way better than the first attempt.
You can see the
So
little
clearly,
band
using a
right
much
there.
bigger piece and doing all of the other little things had helped a lot, and I was really happy with how it turned out. To know if it were actually better, though, and not just a
See,
nicer looking
let's say
piece of
that's
crap,
supposedly the best
I was
one.
gonna have to shoot it.
Did that little thing.
So I got my pellet gun again, and I figured I'd blast the ugly side first, and I was kind of expecting it to just explode like last time.
Boom.
However, it was instead just deflected, and it hit me in the head, and I was genuinely really surprised. There was clearly a significant improvement, and even on the crappy part, it didn't even look like the pellet had a chance of making it through. It only made a small dent before getting completely flattened, and I thought that it was really cool to see it get bounced away as a little pancake. Just for good measure, though, and to make sure it wasn't a fluke or something, I decided to shoot it a few more times, and each time it was bounced away with ease. So apparently, just by squishing it better, I had made it way stronger, and my pellet gun wasn't even a challenge anymore. Instead of exploding it, it was now only making small dents, and after seeing this, I started getting really excited. This is because I now had some real evidence that this wood could stop a projectile, and the idea of stopping a real bullet was feeling like it might actually be possible.
How about an
The
arrow?
only issue was that even with this very significant strength improvement, I was pretty sure that a real bullet would still destroy it.
Yeah.
This is because my pellet gun was only shooting 22 caliber pellets, which weighed less than a gram, and they were only going around 500 feet per second. On the other hand, though, this is the equivalent 22 caliber real bullet, the 22 LR, and it weighs over twice the amount and goes almost triple the speed. In theory, this means that it should be able to deliver over 16 times more energy than the pellet, and I really didn't think my piece of wood could take that. I mean, maybe it could have done something that was double or triple, but over 16 times was just insane. For some reason, though, I still had faith that this wood could do it, but I was for sure gonna have to somehow strengthen it even more. In my mind, there was also only one real way to do this, and I was gonna have to somehow stop it from spreading out. If I were able to do this, this should not only give me something that was significantly denser and way stronger, it should also just be higher quality
You
in
need some kind
general
of mold
and without
to
any of
keep
those
it
diagonal cracks.
that
I
shape.
really thought that it would be enough to stop at least the 22LR, and again, I had some ideas that I thought would work. However, long story short, nothing I did seemed to make a difference, and after a couple weeks of trying a whole bunch of different things, I was kind of losing my mind. This is because I tried everything that I could think of for both the chemical and pressing parts, and it eventually got to the point that I was just blaming the wood itself. I was really starting to think that maybe pine actually just sucked and that it was too soft to hold its shape, so as a completely last ditch effort, I tried switching to oak, which was a hardwood. However, this again didn't seem to make any real difference, and the wood was still just getting squished out. When I saw this, I honestly just kind of felt like quitting, but at the same time, I was starting to think that it was really odd that the paper didn't mention anything about this. I also suddenly realized that they only showed cartoon versions of their press, and this made me start to think that this whole time, they might have been secretly using more than just a simple press. I mean, I have no idea if that's actually true, but I felt that they had to be using something to physically stop it from spreading out, and after 30 minutes of having no idea what I was doing in Fusion 360, I was able to design these two pieces. I then sent them to a machining company, and after a few weeks, I was the proud owner of this hunk of stainless steel. I was hoping that it would magically solve all my problems, and the idea that I had was super simple. All I had to do was wedge in my treated piece of wood, and then on top of it, I would add this other hunk of stainless steel. I could then load this entire thing into my hydraulic press, and now it would be impossible for the wood to squish out on the sides. In my opinion, there was no way that this could fail, and I immediately started
It is
preparing a
gonna
new
fail.
piece of wood. The only tricky part this time was that if I wanted the wood to fit perfectly into my template, it had to be perfectly sized. In an ideal world, I could have just pre-cut it to fit exactly into the template, but that wasn't really possible because the wood expanded while it was being treated. From a bunch of testing, I also found that the amount that it expanded was kind of random, and it depended on a bunch of factors, like how much moisture was already in the wood, and it wasn't going to be something I could reliably predict. So instead, I was going to have to cut it after the treatment, and I went through the whole process of soaking and washing it. Then, when I felt that it was as chemical free as possible, I ran it through my poor bandsaw. Having to cut wood while it was wet and potentially full of chemicals wasn't exactly ideal, except I didn't have many other options. But anyway, up until now, everything seemed to be going decently well until it was fully cut, and I noticed something odd. It looked like most of the inside of the wood was completely dry, and it didn't seem like it had gotten treated at all. At first, I started thinking that maybe the bandsaw had just dried the wood from friction,
No.
but that wouldn't make sense because there was still a perfect line of wetness at the top and the bottom. Either way, I decided to just hope that it would magically be okay, and I carefully loaded it into my new template. Then on top of it, I added the huge metal block, and now I had to load this entire thing into my press.
That's the
To do
reason
this,
why
I just
he couldn't
carefully
also
slid it
squeeze
in,
it that much.
and I
Only
did
the
my
parts that
best to
squeezed
line
were
up
the
all
ones
of
that
the
were wet.
edges. This way, it would be perfectly
Needs to
centered
give
in
it
the
like
middle of the plates,
days,
and when I felt that it
not
looked
hours,
good,
days.
I lowered
soaking.
down the top plate. With all of this in place, it should have been good to go, and all I had to do was start crushing it. This time, I didn't have to worry at all about it squishing out to the sides, and I was also able to go way faster, and this was a million times better than anything I was doing before. Also, just based on the amount of water that was coming out, I felt that there was no way that the inside of the wood wasn't
Stop
treated.
caring of.
In total, I was able to collect a few hundred mils, which to me was way too much if it was just coming from the outer part of the wood, but who knows? Either way, it was eventually done, and over the next few hours, I went back to it every 20 minutes to repressurize it. This wasn't something I'd done in the earlier runs, but from all my failed attempts, I had learned that it was important. This is because as the water boiled out of the wood itself slowly shrank, and the pressure on it gradually decreased. So, if I wanted to maintain the high pressure that was needed, I had to keep coming back to it until pretty much all the water was gone, and then I left it for 24 hours. When I eventually came back to it the next day, I was really curious to see what it was like. At least from the small part that I could see at the front, it already seemed like it was by far the best result that I had ever had, and all I had to do next was open it up. The only thing that I was kind of concerned about was all of the dark goo, and I was honestly really worried that it might have glued the two pieces of metal together. This would make it an absolute nightmare to take apart, but that thankfully wasn't the case. Inside of it was a beautiful piece of densified wood, and it really was by far the best result I had ever gotten. Look at that. That looks really good. And the edges, how flat
That's
they are.
not
Sharp
nice
and
coaster.
flat. That's really
it?
nice. One extremely important thing, too, was that it
cup
didn't have
coaster.
any of those diagonal cracks, and on top of this, it was even thinner than any of the other attempts. Considering that it also didn't push any of its volume out to the side, this meant that it was significantly denser, and overall, it just felt way stronger and more durable. I was genuinely really impressed, and after a long time of going in circles on what seemed to be a really simple task, I had finally made some significant progress, and I felt that it was close to perfect. It really didn't seem like there was much more that I could do to improve it, and I felt that now, it was
I saw
finally
crack.
time to do a
I saw
real
crack.
test. It was time to see if this could actually stop a real bullet, and I honestly felt like it could do it.
I have faith that I could test it like this.
This was also
Oh.
perfect timing because I'd spent the last year trying to get my gun license here in Canada, specifically for this project, and just by chance, I had received it a few days earlier. So, with this license in hand, I was able to legally borrow a .22 rifle from my friend, and I drove very far away to where it wouldn't be a felony to shoot it. I mean, in theory, I probably could have just gone to a local range or something, but for some reason,
Yeah.
I really wanted to do it in a forest, and it had actually taken months to find land that I could legally shoot on. Either way, I then started putting together the whole setup, and I couldn't help but get flashbacks from the time I made thioacetone, and I had to set up a bunch of stuff in a random forest. This time, though, it was actually worse because it was way colder and wet, and it was on and off raining, and I had a lot more stuff to set up. However, it still wasn't that bad because on the drive over, I'd picked up my friend Evan, who runs the channel Code Bullet, and he was helping me out. The only sad part was that he was also not dressed properly at all, and that his first experience in Canada was this wet and cold forest. But anyway, we had eventually set up all
For
the
some in
cameras,
Canada.
and it was time to put the wood in place.
I
To
wouldn't know
do
about
this,
it.
I decided to go with a very sophisticated method, and I just gorilla taped it to a large styrofoam block. Evan then wedged a stick behind it to prevent it from tipping back, and at this point, I was finally ready for the first real test. The only challenge now was that I had to actually have decent aim and hit the wood, and also not destroy my cameras, which were uncomfortably close. Either way, though, with all this in mind, I then loaded the gun with a single 22 LR
Should have
bullet, and it
gone
was
to a
finally
range and
time
gotten someone
to see
who's
if
a
all this
professional.
work was worth it.
Very good shot.
So I just carefully aimed a gun that I had only shot once before, and then I quickly ran to stop the high-speed camera. The moment I got closer, though,
He missed.
I was immediately concerned by what I saw. I then quickly got rid of the gun that I probably shouldn't have been running with, and I went back to take a closer look. So, looks like there's a hole right there. And
Oh, so he did not miss. I thought he missed.
there's a hole on the back too.
Went through. Not bulletproof.
I think the verdict is that it wasn't bulletproof. No! On the bright side, I had actually hit it, but on the sad side, it was pretty clear that a real gun was way more powerful than a pellet gun. Yeah, that didn't work. Just like
That'd
the
be
very
more
first attempt,
damage
it also
to the person.
kind of looked like the back of it had just exploded, and that it hadn't even stood a chance. This was definitely not the result that I was hoping for, and I was genuinely feeling pretty
Because it's
sad about it.
completely solid.
Okay.
There's
That's it.
nowhere for all that force to disperse.
When I got back, though, I was able to clean it up and take a better look at it, and I realized it wasn't actually as bad as I thought. I mean, it still wasn't ideal, and the bullet had clearly gone right through it, but what was important was that it hadn't just catastrophically exploded it. Instead, it looked like it had been sequentially peeled back in layers, and it didn't even seem like much of the wood had been removed. It also seemed like if I pushed on it hard enough, I could basically put it back together, and this made me feel like it wasn't actually that far off from stopping it. I really felt that something just slightly stronger would have been able to do it, and as one final test, I wanted to try adding a second layer. This was actually something that the paper tested, and they found that only one extra layer could make it over 5 times stronger, and I felt that this would be more than enough. To try this, though, I was of course going to have to make at least a couple more pieces, and unfortunately, I had to go back to cooking and crushing wood. However, to go faster, I decided to scale up the
Oh.
whole cooking part, and in this large stainless steel pot, I was able to load in 4 pieces. The setup itself was also super simple, and to keep them all separated, I just used a bunch of glass rods, and I used the stainless steel cookie rack to keep them spaced from the bottom. I also used another cookie rack at the top to help hold it all together, and I wedged in some
Whatever.
heavy
Use
steel
whatever
rods
set this at
to
your
keep everything in
disposal.
place. I was then heating all of this using a generic induction stove, and in general, this was way better than doing each one individually, and it saved me a couple days of work. The only weird part was that I ended up having a lot of trouble with the crushing step, and every piece of wood that I made was having issues. When I took it out of the press, it would be nice and flat, but as it was cooling down, it would slowly get warped and weird, and this was not an issue that I had before. I had no idea why or how the first attempt had just magically worked, but Either way, after a few days of repeated failures,
Probably
I was
whatever
really
components
starting to
the
get
wood had
worried.
in itself.
If I couldn't get the pieces perfectly flat and get rid of all the warping, it would be impossible
Like,
to make a
which one
decent
sucked
two-layered
more
version.
of the
In
chemical, which one
some way,
sucked
though, the
less,
problem ended up
and
actually
blah, blah,
being a
blah,
good
blah,
thing,
blah.
and it made me accidentally improve the wood. This because, in a desperate attempt to fix it, I just threw one of the pieces back into the press at 100°C, and I squished it down with 60,000 pounds of force. I then let it slowly cool down to room temperature, and when I took it out, the piece was not only perfectly flat, it was also even thinner. It was actually about 10% thinner than it was before, which also meant that it was about 10% denser, and it was hopefully even stronger. But anyway, I
Nothing,
then ended up
hopefully.
making a bunch of extras, just in case I needed them, and after a week of frustration, it was finally time to glue some together. To do this, I just chose one of the pieces that I liked the most, and I quickly sanded the top of it. This was very important to do because the surface was so shiny, and I was worried that the glue would have a hard time sticking to it.
Yeah.
When I eventually felt that it was nice and rough, though, I cleaned off the dust with a paper towel, and what I had to do next was add the glue. I had no
Sand,
idea
clean
which
up.
glue to use
Sand,
and
clean
what would
up.
be the best to take a bullet, but I found this stuff at Home Depot, and it claimed that it was impact resistant. So I decided to just go with
Well,
it,
it
and I
says that.
emptied almost the entire bottle, and I did my best to cover the whole piece. Then, knowing that this piece had its
A lot of
grain
them
pattern
say
going in
that
the vertical
they don't really
direction,
work.
I went and got my second piece, and I carefully lowered it down, with the grain going horizontally. This way, the grain patterns would not be perfectly aligned, and they'd be at 90 degrees to each other, and doing it like this was supposed to make it significantly stronger. With that being said, though, I just kept sliding it around to spread out the glue as much as possible, and when I eventually felt that it was nice and even, I squished it down with the large metal block. Just for good measure, I also dropped a tungsten cube on it, and I left it to cure. I then went back to it 24 hours later, and I got rid of all the metal and cleaned it up,
Crushing it the
and
best
this
he
was the final
can.
result.
Crushing it the best
What
he
I had
can.
now was a nice block of densified wood, and just by looking at it, it honestly didn't seem that much stronger. However, the way that it felt was actually very different, and I'm not sure how to describe it. There was just something about it that made it feel way more solid and significantly stronger than the single piece. It also really felt like it would actually be able to stop the 22, and that it wouldn't be a pathetic failure like the other one. There was, of course, only one way to find out, though, so I
Shoot it.
went back out to the forest, and this time, it was bad in a different way. This because I had taken so long to make the wood that all the snow was gone, and it had been replaced with a million mosquitoes and black flies. This is insane. An
Is his
entire
hair
can of
thin
bug
or is
spray
he
didn't even seem to
becoming
help,
bald?
and to survive,
He
we just
balding.
had to go as fast as possible. But anyway, on
Or
a
his
more
hair too
positive
shiny.
note, I had made a much better mounting system for the wood, and I clamped it into this metal thing. I then shoved it into a much stronger and heavier foam block, and it was time to shoot it. Should be it, right? That's all we need. I have faith. I think it'll be good. I think it'll be good. I then loaded the gun with one bullet, and I got ready to blast it. Again, I was really hoping that I wasn't just gonna completely miss it,
Miss, 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 miss.
and then I immediately ran to turn off the high-speed
Now you
camera.
can see the hole being
Unlike
made.
the other time, though, I wasn't immediately disappointed because I didn't see the same clean hole as before. This time, it looked like the bullet had splintered the front part, and for some reason, I felt that this was a good sign. I don't know if it went through.
It went
Yeah,
through.
I don't know if it went through.
Went through.
It went right through. No!
Told you.
How? The moment that I saw this, I was honestly a bit frustrated because I genuinely thought this was going to work.
There's not enough surface
See
area
this?
to spread the
I
force
was also
out
starting to
through.
think that this
All
project might
concentrated
just be completely
together.
hopeless because if I couldn't even stop a 22 LR, there was no chance of making anything I could remotely call bulletproof. Right through. Really? Oh, no. Actually, it stopped it. It stopped it.
Was the
So
wood
the
that went
back
through?
splitting was just absorbing all the energy. If you look how deep the bullet
Yeah,
went,
see? Like I said,
right? It looks kind of the same
the
distance that it
energy did not
pushed
properly
the wood
spread.
out. So
That's why it's
it
getting
stopped
very
it.
damaged.
Oh my god. Is that a success? So apparently, I had
Partially.
just lost hope way too early, and with 2 layers of the densified wood, I had technically stopped the 22LR. In my opinion, this was really cool, but at the same time, I didn't feel that it was quite good enough because the back still got split apart. I was actually a bit
And that
worried that
can
this would happen
cause
though,
more
and
damage.
this was why, just in case, I had also made a 3-layered version. In theory, this should have been even stronger than the 2-layered one, and I felt that it would solve all my problems. However, at the same time, I also felt that this was my absolute last chance to make it work because adding any more layers would make it way too thick. Right now, it was still thinner than just one of the untreated pieces that I had started with, and I felt that this was the absolute limit. If this didn't work, I'd have to come up with some other solution, or more likely, I'd probably just quit. Okay, I think it's good. But anyway, at this point, I was ready to test
It
it,
would be
so I
weird if
carefully
he
aimed the
somehow
gun,
decides to make bulletproof paper.
and this time my aim was terrible. I ended up kind of missing, which was a little bit sad, but what wasn't sad was the result. It looked like the bullet hadn't even made it past the first layer, and just to confirm that this was real, I shot it again. What happened? It just chunked it. That's all it did. Look at that. That's it.
Yeah, like I said, has more surface area for the power to
Yo,
spread out.
not even splintered at all. So apparently, 3 layers was significantly better than 2, and when I looked at the high speed, it looked like the 22LR didn't even stand a chance. I mean, it totally exploded the first layer of wood, but the bullet itself was also completely destroyed, and it was bounced away as a bunch of fragments. After seeing this, I was really excited because I had finally stopped a real bullet using wood, and by definition, I had made bulletproof wood. However, it was also one of the weakest bullets possible, and when I looked up the levels of bulletproof armor, the charts didn't even go as low as 22LR. It seemed like the lowest rating was the common 9mm, which is often used in handguns, and this was the bare minimum
Yeah.
of what many people considered bulletproof. The only scary part was that the 9mm was significantly bigger, and compared to the 22LR, it would have around 2.5 times more energy. On top of that, though, it also had a copper jacket, which would give it more penetrating power, and I really didn't think my poor block of wood could stop one. However, I felt that if I actually wanted to consider what I had made bulletproof, it had to stop a 9mm, and I had thankfully borrowed another gun from my friend. This one just felt way more powerful than the other one, and I was really not feeling optimistic.
They did have more.
Okay. Safety off. My poor wood is just evaporating. This time, I actually saw chunks fly off the piece of wood, and I was also kind of shocked by what I saw. Wait. Yo, it stopped it! It actually stopped it! What the? It's there! It's just flat! Did you see the whole bullet just flattened in there?
Yeah, making it thicker, more
That's
surface area
cool.
for all the force to spread out.
It didn't even get deeper than the 22. They're like the same depth, and it's an injured piece of wood. So apparently, the 9mm didn't actually just destroy it, and adding that third layer had clearly made it a lot stronger. It was also really cool to see the bullet get almost instantly flattened and completely stopped by the second layer, and I was genuinely surprised
Science
that
is
this happened.
crazy.
The only concerning part was when I looked at the back of it, and it looked like it had almost exploded. It was on
Barely
the verge
helped.
of not making it. Either way, though, it did stop it, and at this point, I felt that I could officially say that I'd made some bulletproof wood. I mean, it was of course still far from perfect, but it was way better than anything I ever expected, and it was definitely better than the regular wood that I had started with. This was made especially clear to me when I tried shooting a huge stack of it with the same 9mm, and even with 7 layers, it almost wasn't enough. The bullet was actually really close to going through the entire thing, and in comparison, it was kind of shockingly bad. It literally got stopped in the last one. Wow. With all that being said, though, this entire project was mostly just meant to be a proof of concept and to see if wooden armor was even possible, and I guess the answer is that it is. I mean, it still definitely
Possibly.
needs a lot of improvement, and this is not anything that I would currently want to wear, but I think that it has a lot of potential. I also think that it could be really interesting to try combining it with other materials like plastic, metal, or even Kevlar. I genuinely think that
Only
it's
some type of
possible to make something
plastic.
that's less than half the thickness, but still easily able to stop the 9mm, and maybe even some more powerful bullets. For now, though, I think I'm tired of cooking, crushing, and shooting wood,
Or carbon fiber.
and instead I'm going to work on some more tasty projects, like turning styrofoam into cinnamon candy.
What?
Alright, so this project ended up being a lot more tedious than I initially
That'd be
thought,
dangerous.
and ultimately, it took a lot more than just chemistry to get it done. This is actually one of the major reasons why it took me so long to finish it, and I've been finding that my lack of non-chemistry skills in general have been delaying at least a few other projects. So lately, I've been putting a lot more effort into getting better at things like math, physics, and programming, and thankfully, there's been a really fun, easy, and
Fun
free
out
way
the
for me to
ad.
do this. More specifically, though, I've been using Brilliant, which I think is one of the best
There we
ways to
go.
learn math, data science, and computer science. This is because not only are all their lessons super concise and interesting, they're also all interactive, which I think makes them a lot more fun, and a lot more like a game. On top of that, what I really like is that all their lessons are chopped up into many small sections, which lets me go through each topic at my own pace. This has been great for me because I often only have 5 minutes
I don't
here or
understand
there,
anything.
but I've
Just
still
by
been able to
seeing it,
progress.
I
In
understand
particular, I've been
nothing.
working on the Programming with Python course, and I'm only several lessons in, but I've already learned a lot. I've also made a lot of mistakes though, and what has been really nice is that each time, there's been a super useful and helpful explanation. But anyway, with all that being said, I've been really
Programming, you
enjoying
can probably
Brilliant,
do video
and if
games
you're
or other
interested in
stuff.
learning something new in a fun way,
Make your own
I
smart
definitely
home.
recommend
With your
checking them
own
out.
stuff.
Right now, you can also try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by just going to brilliant.org/Nile Red or by clicking the link in the description. On top of that, the first 200 people who
You
sign
just
up
need
using
to
my
use
link
Raspberry
will
Pis
also get
and
20% off an annual premium
stuff.
subscription.
Make your own
And,
thing.
yeah, that's it. As usual, a big thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. Everyone who
well,
supports
weird
me can see
ways.
all my new videos at least 24
A
hours before I
scientist
post them to
probably
YouTube.
has a
You'll
real
also get
scientist
access to
job.
all the older videos that I
And
had to take down,
be able
and
to
if you
do a
support me
lot
for
of that
$5 or
stuff.
more, you'll get your
Have
name at
proper
the end, as you see
licensing
here.
to manage certain chemicals and stuff. I think I'm talking a little bit too much.